Through the early days of May 1945, long-awaited peace began to creep across a war-torn Europe. On May the 2nd, the Soviet Red Army had captured the German capital of Berlin. Then, 2 days later, on May 4th, German armies in northwestern Europe surrendered. And finally, on May 7th, all German forces surrendered unconditionally. The Nazi Third Reich had been conclusively defeated. While victory in Europe was celebrated across the continent the following day of May 8th, in Dublin, the government of the Irish Free State were dealing with a crisis of sorts. News had leaked out that leading Nazis had arrived at Gormanstown military camp north of Dublin on what was being called a mystery plane that had landed a few days earlier on May 5th. As journalists in Dublin demanded answers, the Irish government were suspiciously tight-lipped about the incident. They did confirm that a plane had indeed landed in Ireland from Nazi-occupied Denmark in the early hours of May 5th, just hours before the German garrison in the country surrendered to the Allies. They also confirmed the plane had been carrying 3 men wearing military uniforms and that at least one of them had been a fluent English speaker. However, after this, they refused to provide any further details as to who these men were. While censors in Dublin were quick to control press speculation in newspapers in the Irish Free State, the international press began to print rumours of who these mysterious 3 men were. Initial reports claimed that one of them was the Irish Nazi William Joyce, better known as Lord Haw-Haw, whose story was recently featured on the show. This was followed by speculation that some of the other passengers might have included Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and even Adolf Hitler himself. Now, in 1945, such claims were by no means conspiracy theories. The Red Army had captured Hitler's bunker on May 2nd, and the Soviet Union's counterintelligence agency, SMERSH, had sealed off the complex. On May 4th, they had found what turned out to be the burned remains of Adolf Hitler, who had died by suicide a few days earlier, but this information would remain a Soviet secret for decades. A British intelligence investigation into Hitler's death by Hugh Trevor Roper would confirm that he had died by suicide on April 30th, but this would only be completed the following November. Therefore, in the early summer of 1945, there was a genuine concern and fear that the Nazi dictator was at large, so claims that he had reached Ireland couldn't be dismissed as impossible. Now, the Irish government in Dublin issued an emphatic denial that Adolf Hitler had been on board the plane. However, when I came across this account, it made me curious about that mystery plane and the 3 men in German military uniforms who had been on board. This podcast reveals the full story and what I found in military archives about that flight. Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer. Now, researching episodes of the show takes me down lots of rabbit holes, but today's one is in particular an intriguing account, but not the one I set out to look for when I started this episode. I'm currently making an episode on Irish neutrality and often repeated rumours that the Irish Free State secretly supported the Nazis. In that research, I came across the story that claimed Adolf Hitler had landed in Ireland on May 5th, 1945. Obviously, it caught my eye, and with a bit of further digging, I came across references to a German plane that had landed north of Dublin in the dying days of the war. I contacted the Irish Military Archives, and they confirmed that they did have a file on the issue, and it was available to the public. Now, after going to Dublin, that file did not disappoint. Spoiler alert, Hitler obviously wasn't on board, but the story of the 3 men who were was in itself very interesting. So after reading the file, I sat down to write the episode which explores Irish neutrality in the Second World War, and I had to include this story because it's just so unusual and to my knowledge had never been published before. I finished the episode yesterday, recorded it, edited, but on listening back it felt like 2 separate shows in one. This story about that flight to Ireland in the dying days of the Second World War is not really related to the podcast on neutrality. However, I didn't want to just edit it out and leave that file to gather dust for another decade until someone finally digs it out and writes about it. So I'm going to give it a podcast of its own today. If you are interested in the file, it's available in the military archives. It's G2X1407. Now, just before I dive into the show, don't forget my first and probably only live show of 2024 is on at the Cork Podcast Festival on September the 6th. I'm really excited about it. The venue is the deconsecrated St. Luke's Church, and I have a really great evening of history lined up. It's woven around interviews and stories, and it's going to be a really special occasion where we'll get to meet face to face. As I said, it'll be the only live show of 2024, and you can get your tickets now in the show notes below. Additional narrations on this episode are by Aidan Crowe, and sound is by Kate Dunley. The craft, later described as a mystery plane by the international press, had first appeared in the skies over Gormanstown military camp to the north of Dublin in the early hours of May 5th, 1945. Alerted initially by the sound of its engines, Second Lieutenant Kevin Ryan peered upwards through the pre-dawn darkness looking for movement anywhere in the skies. Now Ryan would quickly identify a plane which he could see was circling the military camp at Gormanstown at about 1,000 feet, but he was unable to identify it or make out any markings given the low light in the morning hours. Logic, however, suggested it was probably an American or British plane which had flown off course and needed to make an emergency landing. This had happened on countless occasions during the war, given there were numerous military air bases in Northern Ireland and to the east in Britain. So as the plane began its descent, Ryan summoned military ambulances and fire crews onto the runway at Gormanstown, anticipating the plane may be in distress. However, as that craft came into view, it was clear there was nothing wrong with it. The pilot was in complete control and had no difficulty bringing the plane down. However, a sense of anxiety rose in Lieutenant Ryan as the model and markings of the plane became clear. It was a German Junker Ju-88, the most famous Axis bomber of the war that had devastated cities across the continent, including Belfast. Now, as it touched down at 5:15 a.m. in the morning, Lieutenant Ryan and the other military personnel had endless questions. How had this plane managed to reach Ireland? American and British air forces were completely dominant across Europe, so this plane had somehow managed to fly directly across Britain without being shot down. A more pertinent question from an Irish perspective was, though, why had these men come to Ireland? What did they want? And perhaps even more relevant, did the Americans, the Soviet Union, or the British militaries want them? When the plane doors opened, 3 men emerged and offered no resistance. As you heard earlier, they were dressed in military uniforms, but in the dawn of that May morning, it was very clear that none of these men were Adolf Hitler. Their military identifications, which were retained by Irish military intelligence and placed in that archive in Dublin, depict 3 relatively young men. The eldest, the pilot, Herbert Giesecke, was 33, while his 2 passengers were in their early 20s. They were immediately detained and brought to the officers' mess at Gormanstown. After they were given some refreshments, an initial interrogation began by Lieutenant Kevin Ryan. Although he couldn't speak German, the pilot, Giesecke, could speak perfect English. And with the war at an end, he did not hesitate to tell Ryan where they had come from or details of what had been an extraordinary flight to Ireland. Kevin Ryan would later document what Herbert Giesecke said in that interrogation.
They had left Denmark 2.5 hours before, as the German forces in Denmark were scheduled to capitulate at 8 a.m. They had flown across England and had almost landed on an aerodrome in the vicinity of Liverpool. Discovering their mistake, they fired a few bursts at the ground personnel and flew on hoping to reach Dublin.
Now this is fascinating. I haven't come across any other reference to a German plane attacking an airfield in Britain on May 5th, 1945. And I think, and I'm saying this expecting an avalanche of emails correcting me and telling me that I'm wrong, but with caution to the wind, I think this might be an unrecorded but also the last German attack on British soil. The most commonly accepted date for the last aerial attack in the United Kingdom was an air raid on the city of Hull on St. Patrick's Day in 1945. Elsewhere in his interrogation, Giesecke said that the flight path he took brought him over Middlesbrough and then Liverpool. If you are aware of any other details or have heard this story before, please do get in touch. Anyway, we're going down a sidetrack. From an Irish perspective, the most worrying aspect of Giesecke's interrogation came from the next lines in Kevin Ryan's report.
He also stated that more German planes might be expected to land.
The expected arrival of more Germans to the Irish Free State at this critical moment in history as Nazi Germany was collapsing was deeply concerning. The government of the Free State had remained neutral throughout the entire Second World War. In 1940 and 1942 it had come under intense pressure from the United Kingdom and the United States, but it refused to join the Allied cause. Even when it had been clear in the summer of 1944 that Germany would lose the war, the government in Dublin had remained resolute and unwavering in their outward commitment to neutrality. Now, while I will explore this in greater detail in next week's episode, this did lead to widespread speculation in America and Britain that the Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, and his government secretly supported the Nazis. Therefore, if large amounts of Germans began to arrive in Ireland at the end of the war, just as the hunt for Nazis was getting underway in Europe, this would, if anything, only confirm these rumours that the government in Dublin were soft on Nazis. Therefore, it was of the utmost importance to find out who these men were and, more importantly, what they wanted. Hurried phone calls were made from Gormanstown to Dublin, and by 8 o'clock, cars carrying two men, William Warnock and Eamon de Butler, had arrived at Gormanstown. These were senior figures representing the Irish government and military, and they had arrived to conduct a more detailed interrogation. William Warnock was a diplomat and had served as the ambassador in Berlin for several years. He had actually been lucky to survive the worst air raid of the war on Berlin in November 1943, when the Irish legation in the city had been destroyed. The other man, Eamon de Butler, was the Deputy Director of Irish Military Intelligence, and throughout the war he had interrogated numerous German spies who had landed in Ireland. Therefore, both men understood and were acutely aware of the political sensitivities of what they were dealing with, and crucially though, they could also speak fluent German. This would allow them to interrogate all three men separately. They began with the 33-year-old Herbert Giesecke. While this was a name neither man recognised, the Berliner would still recount an extraordinary story of his life in the previous years. Eamon de Butler would later submit a report of what Giesecke told him to military intelligence. It reads like an excerpt from a novel.
He was an instructor pilot in Greece and piloted transport planes for the attack on Crete in 1941. He went to Syria with arms, but there was only a day or two. He served in Romania and then went to Russia. He was in the Crimea in 1941 to 1942. In 1942 he was shot down behind the Russian lines, and he and two companions travelled about 200 kilometres through the Caucasus to get back to his own line.
As remarkable as this war story was, it wasn't a unique experience in the 1940s. There were countless others who had endured similar and even more incredible events during the war. Nor was it really of concern to his Irish interrogators. They needed to know if any of these three figures were of importance and why they had come to Ireland. After interviewing Giesecke, William Warnock and Eamon de Butler interrogated the other passengers, Bernard Krusicina and Horst Schmidt. They backed up Herbert Giesecke's account insofar as they could. But these men had had a more common experience in the war, it might be said. Schmidt had served as a radio operator and navigator. He had been shot down over Germany, and although badly injured, he did return to serve alongside Giesecke and Krusicina. Krusicina, for his part, was actually born in Upper Silesia in Poland, but was ethnically German and had joined and fought for the German army. When the interrogators turned to why these Germans had come to Ireland, the answers were perhaps not as sensational as the events surrounding it, the final days of the Second World War. The trio had been stationed at Grove Air Base in Denmark in the final weeks of the war, but with fuel in short supply, they had seen little action. On May the 4th, German army leaders at Hamburg had surrendered on behalf of all forces in northern Germany, Denmark and Holland. Now, this surrender agreement was due to come into effect at 8 a.m. the following morning. However, the German army was in complete disarray. Even communicating messages to the troops was difficult, and the air crews stationed at Grove Air Base in Denmark only discovered what was happening when they tuned in to the BBC at midnight. Then, an hour later, they heard that Denmark had just declared war on Germany. Now, this raised the possibility that they would be taken captive not by Allied soldiers, but instead by Danish partisans. Now, Herbert Giesecke will claim that he did not want to surrender to partisans because he considered them cowards, but I suspect fear may have been the real reason he sought to avoid the partisans. In previous days, news that Benito Mussolini had been shot dead and then hung upside down by Italian partisans highlighted the summary justice they might face. Giesecke would claim that they had initially tried to fly south to Prague, where German forces were still fighting the Russians. Whether he really did want to do this or not is unclear, but Giesecke claimed bad weather prevented him doing so. Meanwhile, in the early hours of May 5th, military discipline at the base in Denmark began to break down, and officers provided no clear direction or advice about what the troops should do. So finally, around 2:30 in the morning, desperate air crews began to take off in airplanes to escape the surrender that would take place a few hours later. Giesecke was the first pilot to leave the runway, and he assumed others were going to follow him. Now, his decision to fly to the Irish Free State was personal and practical. Weather forecasts predicted good weather that night, which would allow them to make a safe landing. Giesecke also had personal motivations as well. His wife was somewhat coincidentally from Belfast, South Africa, and he hoped to be able to write to her from the Irish Free State, given it had remained neutral. Now, in the following hours and days after these men had arrived at Gormanstown to the north of Dublin, the Irish military kept a keen eye on the eastern horizon, waiting for more German planes to arrive. None did. What happened to the other planes that left Grove Airport in those last chaotic hours of the war is unclear. Although this is something I'll return to in a minute, there was one account that suggested some of them were shot down. However, in early May 1945, when news of the landing seeped out, the press censors in Dublin prevented any commentary on the identities of the crew being published in Irish newspapers. A few lines of basic facts about the landing did appear in the Cork Examiner, but the intelligence file in the military archives contains censored articles that claimed leading Nazis had been on board. Now, as we heard at the top of the show, the censors in Dublin couldn't prevent the international press from repeating such claims around the world. Over the summer of 1945, some of these claims were clearly debunked. William Joyce, better known as Lord Haw-Haw, Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler were all taken prisoner and identified in May, so it was clear they couldn't have been on board. Meanwhile, German radio had announced Hitler's death on May 1st, but the fact that the Soviet Union did not release their evidence that they had found his body only fueled speculation that he had somehow survived. Indeed, the arrival of the German plane at Gormanstown was not the only time rumours he had reached Ireland surfaced in that summer. In August 1945, a Swedish newspaper, Aftonbladet, ran a story about a mysterious Nazi radio station called Dietrich Eckart that was broadcasting from Ireland. Now, that name of the radio station, Dietrich Eckart, is somewhat obscure. Eckart was a German poet who had died in the 1920s, but his work was highly influential in Nazi circles. The article claimed that the broadcasts not only claimed that the Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler was alive, but that the broadcaster sounded very much like him. I will say Aftonbladet was not a very reliable source. It had adopted a stance that was very sympathetic to Nazi Germany throughout the war. However, the Soviet news agency TASS would also make claims that Hitler was in Ireland when it claimed he had been spotted in Dublin dressed as a woman in 1945. Now, the Soviet counterintelligence agency, SMERSH, as I said at the top of the show, knew that this was false. They had, after all, brought what was left of Adolf Hitler back to Moscow in May 1945. Finally, though, in November, British intelligence, through extensive interrogations of people who had been in Hitler's bunker in the final days of the war, were able to piece together what had happened and confirm that Hitler had taken his own life by suicide. Now, in terms of the story of the three airmen who had reached Ireland, their mission was successful, on a personal level at least. On the 8th of May, Giesecke and Schmidt were allowed to write to their relatives. Irish military intelligence retained copies and translations of these letters. Giesecke wrote to his wife in South Africa, and it appears to have been the first communication between the couple in a very long time. He spoke of how his daughter must have grown a lot, how he missed his wife, and then his own anxieties and insecurities surfaced when he pondered whether she had missed him. Schmidt would write a letter to his grandfather and possibly a second one to his mother, although that one wasn't retained in the military archives. Neither man made any reference to how they felt about the war. Given they were writing on May 8th, just as the war ended, the overwhelming emotion and sense from the letters was one of relief. However, as I say, none gave any details about their own actions or events during the war, save Giesecke's account of his escape through the Caucasus back in 1942. There was certainly no sense of regret over actions they had carried out during the war, and it's certainly difficult to believe that Herbert Giesecke, who had spent a year in Russia, was not at least aware of the atrocities being carried out there. What happened to the three men in the longer term is very unclear. They were handed over to the British in the following weeks, and the bomber they had arrived in was flown back to Britain in early June. When British pilots arrived to collect that bomber, they also carried out an interrogation of the three. Now, leading these British interrogators was Captain Eric Brown, who published a memoir about his wartime experiences, which included details of the story that Giesecke told him. What's interesting about this account is that it's clear that Giesecke's story was changing. By the time he spoke to Eric Brown, it was June 1945, and the war was over a month, and Giesecke was clearly trying to adapt his life and story and wartime experiences to a post-war world. He now claimed that he was almost a victim, and said that he had been born in South Africa and effectively press-ganged into the German army by the Gestapo. However, in his initial interrogation with Irish intelligence, he told them a very different story. They had his identification papers which showed he had been born in Berlin, and he told them he had been living in South Africa and had coincidentally been back in Germany on holidays in the summer of 1939. He was what was called a potential officer, and he expected to be called up. So he sent his wife back to South Africa and he enlisted in the German army. There was no sense, however, that he was forced to enlist or even bitter about it. He also, unsurprisingly, didn't tell his British interrogators that he had fired at the ground crews outside Liverpool. Instead, he claimed that there had been originally 4 bombers flying in formation from Denmark west towards Ireland. He said that one had been shot down over Manchester and that the other 2 were lost, presumably crashing into the Irish Sea. I have to say, this version of events is not very reliable or believable. Eric Brown wrote his memoir 40 years after he had spoken to Giesecke, and it's clear that the German was trying to distance himself from his own wartime experiences in this new account of his life in the 1940s. What happened to the 3 of them after they were taken to Britain is unknown. Irish military intelligence closed their file. They had no longer any interest in the 3 men. But I thought this was interesting from the perspective that it was one of the final acts of the Second World War in the Irish Free State at least. However, rumours that the Irish Free State government colluded and collaborated with the Nazis have persisted for decades and are quite commonly repeated today in online discussions about the war. These include claims that German U-boats refuelled in secret bases off the west coast of Ireland, all the way through to the notion that the Irish Free State, by accident or design, aided the Luftwaffe during the Blitz. Now, in the next show, I'm going to explore these claims, where they come from, and what the truth behind them is. It's a real case of trying to separate fact from fiction. Finally, before I go, don't forget you can get tickets to my upcoming live show on September the 6th in Cork. As I say, it's probably going to be the only live show of 2024, so I'd love to see you there. You can get tickets in the show notes below. Until next time, Slán.